Welcome everyone, both participants and audience members, to another session of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. My name is Chelsea Estancona. I am an associate professor at the University of South Carolina, and my co-organizer is Andre Scannon at Vanderbilt University. The OPSC came into being several years ago now, actually 10 years plus, started in 2015. And the whole purpose here is to sort of connect members in between meetings of the Peace Science Society. And so to really celebrate research that we have going on at all times of year and hopefully connect scholars from across different communities that attend Peace Science. We do have, I believe, still an X account, and then you can find us via the Peace Science website as well if you are looking to go back and perhaps see this presentation or take a look at other ones that we have recorded. So to get us started today, we have a fantastic paper titled Socially Constructed Blame, Peer Influence and the Punishment of Past Informants in Transitional Justice. And we have Howard Liu here from the University of South Carolina to present. This is co-authored work. Really excited to see this. And then we have two absolutely fantastic discussants. We have Mara Revkin, thank you very much for being here with us, and Narmin Yousef-Butt, who will also be providing amazing comments. We're super grateful. We can't do this without discussants, and so really the labor that y'all put in is very much appreciated. So just to give everyone who's joining us, who's coming in, kind of the basics of participation. Howard will give us about a 15-minute presentation. At any point, attendees, you are welcome to leave comments or questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring those to make sure that we can come back to those. Following discussant comments, which will come after his presentation, we'll, of course, then prioritize the audience comments. So please, 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 if you have something that you would like to add in or some thoughts on how Howard and co-authors can advance this paper, we would love to hear that. Howard, as you go to share your screen, one thing I forgot to mention is that if there's anything in particular you'd like the audience to kind of focus on, or anything about the stage of the paper that you think is really valuable for us to know, is it about to go out? Is it like whatever, things that we can help with, please feel free to mention those as you discuss. Okay, so I will go ahead and turn this over when you are ready to Howard. You can start screen sharing and we'll enjoy your presentation.
All right, let me share in large. Can everybody see this? If you can you give us a thumbs up?
Good to go.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you all for coming here and join this online panel. I'm Howard Liu, and just feel very excited and privileged to be able to present this paper here. So this is like really early on. We just got our result like late last year, so we're right now just having this first draft and trying to improve. So if you guys have any comments on framing, theory, analysis, basically all kinds of suggestions would be super appreciated. So this work as a co-author with Anya Stewart, U.S. Davis, Juan Telas, and also a colleague, Yiting Wang in Taiwan, that we study informants and how informants, their public perception can be socially constructed. Okay, so why this paper can be important? So that's one of the important questions we asked at the beginning, right? So we think it is important because informants are everywhere. We know that informants are prevalent in authoritarian countries. For example, if you are familiar with Stasi Germany, the government and secret police hire tens of thousands of informants so that they can infiltrate and monitor the society. And a well-known example is authoritarian East Germany. And you can see this is one of the libraries in Germany right now. There are thousands of profiles for informants. And informants are not just in authoritarian countries, but also prevalent in conflict wars. So I remember when I presented at a TJ workshop that was hosted by Mara, a former ambassador told me that Howard, this project is going to be very useful because Zelensky is going to face this big problem because he knew that there are so many infiltrated Russian collaborators and informants that are helping an invasion of Russia. So this is a big problem for them when they're in a war. So their informants are everywhere, not just in autocracy, but also during conflict and war situations. So we just need more study on this. So what's a puzzle? Like what's a problem here that we need to solve? So let me give you an example. For instance, this person on the left, his name is Sasha Anderson. He was a prominent poet and writer in previous East Germany regime. But later on, after the democracy transition, people knew that he was hired and recruited by the Stasi as an informant to inform on and betray their colleagues who were basically dissenting against the government. And his relationship and his role was exposed and publicly shamed. So he was basically socially ostracized. No one wanted to be associated with him. He struggled to find jobs, he struggled to mingle back into society. So pretty tragic situation. On the other hand, Knut Wallenberger, he was also a writer and poet, but during this transitional period, he was exposed, but there was no major public shaming and naming. There's no public reckoning. He was basically okay. Like people knew he was an informant under Stasi, but largely okay. So that's basically kind of illustrate or motivate the paper that we're writing. Like two questions. One is why do informants receive so much different level of blame and social professional punishments? And what drive or what shapes the public opinion toward these past informants and collaborators? So these are questions that basically fundamentally shape this project. Okay, so what do we know from literature? So there basically two major points I wanted to highlight. So one point is that the existing literature on TJ tend to be more individualistic, meaning that a lot of research focus on how individual preferences shape public opinions to TJ, right? How individuals' political views, political ideologies, or their prior exposure to violence can be associated with their view about those perpetrators and how do they think that they should be treated. Like Mara, her amazing literature review paper that's written. That's all good, but a potential problem is that they often assume opinions are formed independently, where we do not have a lot of studies that can actually help us to guide into the study of how social or peer influence can help shape the public opinions. So this is kind of largely missed. So the second gap that we identify in the literature is that a lot of paper that tend to target on these clear subject with the clear culpabilities. A lot of research focus on perpetrators who have involved directly in violence, such as dictators, secret police, fighters, and combatants. And there are some recently very exciting work, like Mara's work and also Narmin's work, that started to look at these kind of ambiguous actors who are, for example, like civilian collaborators, who are not actually a part of a regime or part of the official part of the rebel groups, but also they support or collaborate with fighters and regimes. For example, in a civil war situation, they may have cooked for or married to fighters. So these are really great new innovation in literature. But a tendency in literature is that people assume that more ambiguity can be potentially resolved when you provide more information for the public. For example, when we told the public that, this individual basically cooked for, this individual who married to, and this individual actually helped fighting or paying taxes. But based on these situations, how do you evaluate? But in this paper, we'll show that it may not necessarily be the case when providing more information can help resolve this ambiguity. On the contrary, by providing more information may actually make decision even harder to make. Like some people do it for benefit, but later on they apologize. Some people they do it because they're coerced and they're showing remorse. So like providing more information does not necessarily help us to make the decision easier for the public. And we say that when the decision is not easy and hard to make, This is where social influence will come in to help shape the public opinion. Okay, so newspaper we argue that informants is particularly ambiguous perpetrators and hard to judge for two primary reasons. One is that informants, they're often trigger this fundamental hatred or resentment from the public because these informants are oftentimes covert and hidden in their social relationships. They are oftentimes your colleagues, your close friends, or maybe your spouse that actually betray you, inform you upon. So when you realizing that people who betray you are closely associated with you, often trigger this strong hatred and label people as traitors, rats, and moles. So there's a deep resentment oftentimes associated with informants. However, on the other hand, it's also well-known, well-documented situation where a lot of informants, they do not do it for free or do not do it voluntarily. They are being coerced to provide information to the government. So they can be threatened to be killed or their family can be threatened. So they do it because they're under state repression. So that's like a different incentive that will be making judgment more difficult. And we can provide more information, but providing more information may actually make things even harder, right? So, for example, if one informant reported someone who's actually guilty, so that's good. But they may have done it because they are profiting, right? They got money into the pocket, they are rewarded. So that's not kind of good, kind of bad. But maybe later on, after regime transition, they publicly apologize, saying that I realized that what I did was wrong. I feel deeply sorry about it. So that's good. So providing more information may not actually help people to make their judgment easier. So we say that when the public are provided with conflicting attributes and features, and also there's no strong social consensus on how to deal with these informants, they actually open up space for people wanting to hear what other people say and think. So like I said before, when there's a normal ambiguity, citizens tend to refer to their peers and social networks for answers so that they have a way to address their uncertainty. And there are potentially three primary reasons that citizens can accept the peer cues. One is the passive conforming. So individuals may not entirely agree about the peer cues, but they go along because they want to fit in, right? They don't want to stand out as someone who's different. So it's kind of like a social pressure mechanism. Second is that people may just being lazy, right? Cognitively lazy. They don't want to spend a lot of mental energy to try to figure things out. So they just take whatever is provided and just go along. Last is more active, like active conforming. So people, when they have difficulty digesting information, want to make decision, they may genuinely think that people they trust or people they trust in their close social network may have thought it through or have more knowledge about it. So they will just reference and borrow their opinion and into their own to update their own. So it's kind of a social influence mechanism that can at play. So very quickly, we generate two hypotheses related to our theory. First one is that when assessing the culpability of double subjects, such as informants, we expect that exposure to peer judgments increase conformity in blame attribution. Second is that when reliance on peer cues should be stronger when the comparison text, like some people do it because they are being coerced or somebody they didn't show remorse. When they see this complicated motives and consequences, they may be more likely to resort to peer cue. Okay, so we test our expectations in the context of Taiwan. We think that's the ideal case for TJ and informant accountability because during 1950 to 1990, 40 years, there was a massive informant to be implemented. Research and documents say that there's almost 1 per 200 people having informants in their society. So they're everywhere. It's well documented based on the declassified documents. They are universities, churches, neighborhoods. An interesting fact is that transitional justice process had not started early on. It's actually pretty recent because the transition is pretty slow in Taiwan, so it didn't start until 2018 and 19. Because of slow transition, the public still haven't had a strong idea of what should we do with the TJ, right? People are being ambivalent. So one of the major debate is that how much information should we be revealing in the surveillance files? People do not agree that we should reveal all the names. Other people say that we should reveal all the names to be completely transparent. People also debating on how do we deal with individuals who are being identified as informants. Should we punish them or should we forgive them? I have no idea. So this pervasive collaboration and also no settled social consensus make our study, make Taiwan as ideal case to study what we want to study. Okay, so on our design, so we filled and got our survey result done in late 2025 with more than 3,000 respondents. So a lot of money to spend, so really like it was a big effort. And then we test two outcomes. One is that which informants profile do survey respondents think that should be blamed? The second is that do you think someone is not just deserving to be blamed, but also exposed? And also, we kind of vary these important attributes for informants, like voluntariness, right? Do you do it under coercion? Do you do it for money or free? Who did you betray? Did you betray family, friends, political allies, or someone who's a stranger to you? Do you show remorse later on? What's your current status? Are you just a normal citizen, or are you running for office? How accurate was your information? And what is motive? Like I said before, did you inform someone who's actually guilty, or you inform someone who's actually innocent? So kind of provide different incentive in the positive and negative direction and allow people to judge. So we have three types of treatment conditions. One is the pure conjuring. As I mentioned before, we randomize these attributes alongside of A and B and make people to choose without any pure Q information. The second condition is that we provide this clickable box saying that, do you know what other people think? Like how respondents who share similar background like you think, this may actually help you to make a choice. So we designed this box as a clickable so they can voluntarily decide whether they want to take the cue. So that's a second condition. The third condition is that we also randomize a set of respondents saying that we not only provide you the cue, we also give you the answer, right? We allow you to directly or exposed or forcefully exposed to information. We say that among respondents who share similar background like you, there are maybe 80%, 85%, this is randomly assigned to choose informant B or A, and then another attribute to be randomly assigned. So basically force them to see the peer influence or peer opinions. Okay, so very quickly on the results. On H1, the peer effect, we see that when people are being forcefully exposed to peer cues, they're more likely to conform, basically conforming what is provided. So we see positive and significant results across the board. And the result is still robust after we have asked how many questions they have answered. So we're assuming that when they're answering more questions, they may be more tired, wanted to rely on cues. And after controlling that, we see similar results. And then we are investigating this voluntary exposure. It is kind of interesting because in our survey, we do not randomly assign people on the queue. We actually give them a choice. So when we give them choice, the relationship can be endogenous, right? People who want to conform may self-select them into clicking the box to see the peer cues. So we may not be able to identify this causal effect because we have this like allowing choice kind of situation happening. So what we do here is that we introduce a exogenous variation, which is because we as a survey designer, we know who can get the treatment, right, to the box. So we randomly assign people who can take the box or not, and that will determine whether they can actually have a choice and when to use that to predict the outcome. So kind of providing a kind of similar instrumental variable situation when the IV, the Z variable is exogenous to the outcome. So kind of a great instrumental variable design. We can talk more in the Q&A. So quickly on the results, we see that after we have used this IB design, we see even stronger result for people who see the peer queue and to conform, right? People more likely to conform when they self-select themselves into the peer queue treatments. So it kind of makes sense. And secondly, on the task difficulties, we see that when people are exposed with very difficult tasks, like positive and negative in the conjoint, they got more confused or feel more challenging. They're more likely to seek out to the peer queue. They will more likely to conform to peer queue. And that effect is similar in terms of the outcome of the blame, but also the public exposure outcome. And we were interested in who are taking the queue, and also people are asking who are taking the queues. So we do some preliminary analysis. We find that younger people tend to be more likely to take the queues. And it kind of makes sense because younger people who may not have a stronger political prior or may not actually experience the repression period of time, so they don't have a strong opinion, so they may more likely to take their peer information and use that to update themselves. So we see that as younger people is more likely to conform than the older population. So two quick takeaways. We think that it's kind of useful, interesting to think that TJ is not just a process of individual decision making. It's probably more useful to think about TJ is a collective, socially constructed process in terms of understanding what should we do. So truth commissions and public trials, they work partly because they provide information. They provide a signal of the public judgment so other people can adapt upon. So who speaks first and how loudly may matter as much as the facts themselves in terms of TJ. And another point, which is more broader, is that we argue we find ambiguity is kind of a scope condition for influence. Pure effects is larger and stronger when more evaluation is just very difficult. People are uncertain. So maybe it can be useful for people like us who do survey experiments to ask ourselves, how contested is our outcome, right? Is it easy for individuals to make choices, individual choices? If that's not the case, maybe it's not the best way to assume that individual decision making is easy and where we may actually open up spaces for social influence. And that's all. I hope I keep in time. Thank you all for paying attention. I look forward to your feedbacks. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Howard. So we'll go directly to Mara for discussant comments.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you, Howard, for sharing this fascinating work. And it's really it's a pleasure to be in conversation with Howard and also Narmin, who are two scholars who are doing some of the absolute most innovative work in this research area. So excited to hear what others have to say too. I'll keep my comments brief, and then maybe I'll jump back in if we have time. But this paper, I think, is so important and is one of the papers paper you read where there's a finding or an intervention that sort of shakes up the existing approach to studying a particular phenomenon in ways that, when you think about it, are fairly intuitive but haven't been done before. So the idea that really judgments about collaboration are intensely social. I'm absolutely guilty myself of being one of the people who had studied this or made assumptions about sort of the individual basis or the idea that sort of in common types of survey questions for these studies will ask, would you be comfortable with this person sort of moving into the house next door to you or being your neighbor? And we don't think of, so neighborhoods are social places and gossipy places where people are, I read just now there's a huge fight on my neighborhood listserv about what is the appropriate level of noise for dogs to be making. And so I'm not sure why, this time, myself included, we would think that one person would sort of be making decisions about a neighbor in isolation from what their other neighbors think. So hugely important, and makes a bridge between the political psychology literature on peer effects and this setting of public opinion and attitudes about wartime or previous collaboration or past offenses. So something that I think now that you've put it out there is intuitive, but just hasn't really been deeply studied before. I also think the paper has a lot of important insights on some of the hazards of information, or cautionary notes about information not necessarily being clarifying, which also has really important policy implications because a lot of the programmatic and policy interventions around transitional justice are information related, like truth commissions, but also memory initiatives, things like museums. So I think thinking carefully and about sort of the assumption that more information is good is an extremely helpful intervention. It follows on work. I see also connections between your work and work that others have done, pointing to some of the potentially sort of emotionally harmful consequences of memory initiatives or Balcell's mixed findings on museums sometimes triggering very strong emotional responses, and also how information is perceived. It can reinforce existing cognitive biases. So I think that this paper also makes an important contribution to some of the sort of cautionary research that's out there. So I think, yeah, so hugely important contributions here. Three questions that I think you're already thinking through and maybe would just love to hear more about. So is the temporal distance from the past conflict or violence or trauma a scope condition for moral conformism? The Taiwan case involves trauma that happened several decades in the past, even though it remains very politically salient in the present. And there haven't been many longitudinal surveys conducted over time. I hope there will be more. But surveys conducted, I guess, at different points in time in Iraq suggest that proximity to the conflict is an informant. Recency of violence, proximity to the conflict are important factors in attitude formation. So do you expect that peer influence operates with the same strength in contexts where violence might be more recent and the information environment is more actively contested, such as Ukraine? That's a parallel that you mentioned already. And does a moral conformism mechanism work the same way when the trauma is immediate, when social norms around blame are still being actively formed, such as during an ongoing conflict, rather than perhaps sort of inherited or learned from peers or public education or museums about the past? And I suspect that peer influence might be even more powerful, or that the strength of these peer effects might vary in really interesting ways across different contexts, and particularly with respect to the recency of the violence. Also wondering how, second question is how peer cues might interact with formal institutional cues or cues from elites. So you isolate the effect of peer judgment, what ordinary citizens like the respondent believe, but in real transitional justice settings, citizens are simultaneously exposed to lots of different cues from elite institutions like truth commissions, courts, as well as from politicians and political leaders. So the paper mentions the case of a DPP legislator who publicly confessed to having been an informant. So does that kind of elite public admission function similarly to peer cues? Is it more or less powerful, sort of more or less credible than the opinion of someone who's just like you? And more broadly, do you think that formal institutional verdicts like a court conviction or a truth commission determination, what is sort of the weight of those different cues relative to peer influence? Can they be a substitute for it? Can they amplify it or crowd it out or undermine it if they're contradictory? So just sort of thinking about in terms of the broader, the implications of this work for transitional justice mechanisms that might be helpful. And then so a third question is, are peer cues more powerful at overriding individual judgment when the informant was coerced? The agency attribute in the conjoint, so whether the informant acted voluntarily, in exchange for money or because the family would be harmed, is the dimension that's most directly relevant to legal standards of duress. So putting my lawyer hat back on, and in my paper with Christian Gao in Iraq in 2023, we found that coercion did significantly reduce punitiveness in our sample in that context, but the effect was quite conditional. And your paper shows that peer cues shift blame attribution even when coerced information is provided to respondents. And that strikes me as one of the most normatively significant findings of the paper. So what I'd like to hear more about is whether the peer effect is heterogeneous across the coercion attribute. Are peers especially effective at overriding individualistic assessments when the informant acted under duress? The case where independent moral reasoning should, in theory, most favor leniency. And if so, that would suggest that peer conformism is most likely to produce unjust outcomes precisely in those cases where justice would require the most protection against it. In closing, just a couple of suggestions and ideas for the conclusion to address. I know that's still in progress. Thinking more through the normative implications of the findings for transitional justice design, which is something with which I struggle myself, because as an empiric system social scientist, I tend to sort of want to take these findings and give them to the lawyers and policymakers to decide what to do about them. And I struggle myself with some of these normative questions about what should the role of public opinion be in transitional justice. But I think, this data has powerful policy implications, and we do want to sort of try to engage, I think, or shape the normative conclusions or implications as best we can, so that also policymakers don't take the data and sort of run with it and do things that we might disagree with. So if peer cues can systematically shift blame toward people who acted under coercion, then that has real stakes for the legitimacy and fairness of informal accountability mechanisms like public some of the sort of public shaming sanctions that are happening in Ukraine now, also sort of less formalized and more bureaucratic rather than legal processes like lustration or vetting that have more of an administrative component, and tend to not be as regulated. So the paper's, I think, findings that suggesting that social conformism isn't irrational. It can be a very reasonable response to normative uncertainty, is important, but that doesn't mean it reliably. It doesn't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily produce reliable outcomes, and so I would like to see you engage sort of more with that tension directly. And then just a last point I forgot to mention. I think there is a way that you can also connect this research agenda back to some of Kalibas and others' works on intimate violence and civil war, because we know that collaboration and other forms of betrayal and the violence associated with them are extremely intimate and socially constructed, but we haven't really thought about the ways in which judgments or perceptions of those behaviors are themselves also very intimate and socially constructed in sort of the neighborhoods where people affected by these past abuses live. So I think maybe referencing some of the work that's been done on intimate violence and the social dimensions of that could also be a helpful through line. But just absolutely fascinating paper. Congratulations. Really learned so much from your work, and also excited to hear what Narmin has to say.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mara. Okay, Narmin, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Thank you so much, Chelsea and Mara, for your comments. Howard, I really enjoyed this paper. It's well executed and creative and makes a genuine contribution to how we study public attitudes towards transitional justice. I wish I could have read this paper a couple of months ago while I was developing my book and designing some of the experiments on how to develop and how to look at how the collaborator identity is formed. So I have 6 points, but Mara's covered some of them. So I'll go through them relatively quickly, and then I can also send them to you. So the paper claims to rule out cognitive laziness as a mechanism using the instrumental variable results, because compliers in the voluntary exposure condition must actively click to view peer information, because these compliers show even larger effects than the forced exposure group. You argue that it cannot be about avoiding efforts. It has to be genuine moral updating. Now, I do have some concerns about this. First, clicking a box can just take a couple of seconds. A reviewer can argue that it's not really meaningful cognitive effort. A respondent can simultaneously just be lazy about evaluating complex profiles and willing to click a button. the bar for effort here is a bit lower, is what someone can say. Second, the comparison between compliers and the full sample conflates different populations. I won't go into more of the methods concerns. I will send you what I wrote down. I think this would be a bit helpful if you can expand on this, maybe in the appendix, but maybe just a couple of sentences in the manuscript itself. Um, the You have a point where you say that about consensus, 80 to 95%, and I know why you vary the number itself, but I would push you a bit on this. In the real world, do you actually think that people would find opinions that would be this percentage? Now, I've seen similar work done where people justify why is it that they've selected a specific value based on either qualitative work that's done before or just judgments based on focus groups. But I would push you on justifying why is it that you selected those specific percentages. Tai I also have a concern regarding Taiwan as just a case. Taiwan is a single case with specific features that you mentioned, a gradual transition, a competitive former ruling party, extensive but non-violent surveillance, and then contested transitional justice system that became decades after democratization. Um, I do wonder when it comes to these features how they play a factor. What could be here considered some of the scope conditions? Would you see that this argument then would translate or replicate in places like, let's say, Iraq or Colombia, or in in places where there's abrupt transition, like East Germany? You mentioned some of the examples in your introduction, but I think just showing how this work can generalize to other places, or even places like South Africa. Um, would this generalize to post-conflict settings with abrupt transitions or contexts with completed lustration? And if it doesn't, I think that's fine, but it would just have to be very specifically stated. I have some concerns about demand effects that I don't think the paper fully addresses. When respondents are shown that 80 to 95% of people like them choose a specific profile, they may infer that let's say profile A is correct or the expected answers, not because they genuinely might be updating their moral judgment based on peer norms, but because they want to comply with what the experimenters appear to want. Now, this tends to be a standard concern, and I think reviewers might raise that. Um, I think the random assignment of the peer suggested profile does protect against directional bias, but it does not protect against inflated effect magnitudes. So this is just something to keep in mind, and I would try to address the question about demand effects. Um, I also have some comments regarding your findings regarding the younger respondents. You state that younger respondents might be a bit more susceptible to peer influence, and I think that's really interesting, but the interpretation just seems a bit underdeveloped, and you can develop it a bit more because I think there's a great contribution here. Um, First, is this a story about age or cohort? Younger Taiwanese have no personal memory of the White Terror. They did not live through the martial law or experience surveillance directly as much as the older respondents may have. The older respondents may have more anchored views because of lived experience, not because of something intrinsic to just being older. I would say, and I would ask you this question, and you don't have to answer this now, but I would think about this in a different context, say a recent conflict where the younger people were directly affected. So Iraq, Syria, even Iraq, even Libya. The pattern actually might be reversed. Second, younger respondents in this sample may differ from the older respondents in ways just beyond the age, digital literacy, political engagement, trust in the survey, attention to task, because of the nature of how the survey is carried out. I think that you show that respondents are more likely to voluntarily seek out peer information, the younger respondents. But this could just reflect comfort with clicking and exploring rather than genuine uncertainty about moral judgments, because once again, they're younger. They might be more familiar, let's say, with the computer. There's the composition issue. The sample does overrepresent younger, more educated, more pro-independence respondents. So I would try to address some of these concerns if you can. And finally, I I know the conclusion is not written, and this is something that Mara also touched on. I think this is such a great paper, and it can have implications for so many different lines of literature. Um, but I want to push you on the normative implications of the findings, which are largely left unaddressed. The paper suggests the blame is socially constructed through peer influence, but is this really a problem? The framing sometimes implies that socially influenced judgments are less legitimate or more prone to becoming justice. But one can equally argue that peer deliberation is valuable. It reflects democratic accountability, aggregates distributed moral intuitions, and allows communities to collectively work through difficult questions about responsibility. The results show that peer influence increases punitiveness. Is this normatively desirable? It presume it presumably depends on whether the peer consensus is tracking something meaningful, essentially about culpability, or whether it's driven by unrelated factors like in-group dynamics, political opportunism, or just scapegoating. And I think this is where I would think about the larger implications. What do the findings imply for how, let's say, truth commissions should be designed? Should public deliberations about accountability be encouraged or approached with caution? Should we worry about social media amplifying peer effects in ways that distort accountability and preferences? And in addition to that, I would also think about in regions where there are other cues besides just looking at your neighborhood or looking at an individual where you would get this information from. Mara covers a really big point, which is on like elites, that people get different sorts of information. I recently did a study in Syria where I actually look at cues that civilians get from elites and how that can actually impact their judgments versus, let's say, something they might have gotten from a family member or even a name, someone in their community. So I think you do have to loosely address the fact that there's different forms of information. Why is that this form of getting information matters more? Why is this more significant, less other than like other forms of information? Another thing would be, I guess, to think a little bit more about another scope condition, which would be what about in areas where collaboration is tied to a specific identity group? So in the case of Iraq, at times collaboration can be associated with one sect versus the other. In the case of Afghanistan, it was the same exact thing, sect or ethnic group. In the cases when we do have information cues like those, do we really depend on what our peers might say? So I would try to think about that more. It's completely fine if your work doesn't generalize in those cases, but I think in that case, and you would have to write and develop the scope conditions a bit more so we can know that where is it? Where are the cases that this would generalize to? Where can we use Taiwan as an example for other places? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Narmin. Howard, let me give you just a few minutes to, if there's anything you want clarification on or to respond to or to, sort of get additional thoughts from our discussants. And then certainly if I'm not seeing any comments or questions in the chat yet, but please feel free to add them in. So back to you, Howard.
Um, Yeah, this is a great set of comments. I appreciate it. Maybe I will think about questions later on when I kind of address them a little bit. So maybe I can address Mara's comments first. I just love all the interaction effect tests that you have mentioned, and we will do them all. Because right now we just have done only the first round of analysis, so there's a lot more we can do. And this interaction between time, elites, and how information from truth commissions could play a different role. So the interesting fact is that in Taiwan, everything is just started. There's no information. No one know how to do. Like governments even have no idea what to do. So what they do right now is that they basically release all the surveillance document to the public and do whatever you want. And the society also have no clue what should we do about this. So when there is like one or two individuals being publicly shamed and exposed, like all the legislators saying that we should do one thing, and other legislators say that we should not do one thing because some of them are tied up to the current democratic regime, so others are not. Like this is very complicated. So when we were designing the survey experiment, we didn't introduce elite Q because it's not existing any for now. But I think it's like actually important. So I think another reason, in addition to not insisting elite queue, is that I really like what Chelsea was recommending me the other day, that a lot of people who study peer queues are mostly thinking about this top-down process and little work actually thinking about the social bottom-up process. And that's actually pretty important right now in Taiwan because the government is taking no stance at all. And then all these museums, they basically have no narratives at all. So yeah, just important for us to think about what analysis we can do or how we frame our work. And Mara, you mentioned this temporal proximity to violence. That's also a very important point because in Taiwan, not well, even though it's like a very traumatic period of time, not everybody experienced the violence. Only part of the population experienced that. So not everybody. And also, the most repressive time was in the 50s and 60s. And then they're also part of repression later on. But even so, the current population, no matter they're older or younger, they generally do not experience that directly. And younger people is particularly because they're just learning this from social media or textbook. So people are more distant to the violence in the past. So the situation kind of similar to like Laya's work on studying like Spanish repression when they ask people currently, but Spanish repression happened in 1930 and 1940. So maybe that's another like important scope condition we should mention is that how do people attribute blames when they're judging something really, really far away? That's very important for us. And fortunately, like we have also asked questions in our survey that, oh, have you have a family's member who are being a political prosecutor? So we can actually analyze that. On another point that Mar and Narmin both mentioned is the normative component. This is actually really, really interesting because when we were writing up, so oh, okay, this is an effect of the social cue. That what does this speak about policymaking? And then when I was in Taiwan later last year, I was just talking to my colleagues, and then I think one message is that when there is basically um, an an empty space for narratives, it's important to have someone to actually stand up to say, all right, this is a narrative, and then we spread, right? Someone need to take the first initiative and make it loud. So I think we probably want to write that in our conclusion as a policy suggestion, saying that whether you are the government, because the government right now is very democratic against the previous authoritarian regimes, it's the time to make up or come up with a narrative. And then think about how can you channel that through social network. So we're thinking maybe social medias, right, through schools are important, or for through educational systems, maybe important venues for people to spread around their peer circles. So actually, we're fortunate to have another opportunity to do a follow-up survey. It has done. We ask people, okay, so when you are uncertain about these TJ policies, what are the channels you would seek to? So we give them a bunch of other choices, and the result will come back like in a month or two. So we may add that into our study, saying that these may be the channels of peer cues people may resort to. So that's also part of the reason why when I was writing this final slides, I say that who speaks first and who's speaking loudly may actually take an important effect because people are just ambiguous and uncertain. And I just love all the comments that Narmi was coming up, and many of the comments kind of resonate to the comments I got in the TJ workshop at Duke. Many people mentioned about this 80 to 85% is like a random, arbitrary percentage. So yeah, we probably should have thought through that, but retrospectively, when I was thinking about this comment, I actually think that this kind of makes sense because we want to have a strong peer effect so that people can take on. If you say that was like only 30% of people say that, it's like we are not giving people a strong prime. So we want a prime that kind of strong, but not also deterministic. That's why we also vary this percentage. So I think you're right that it's not potentially realistic because in Taiwan there's no consensus, but it also provides some kind of a realisticity because we kind of provide a signal to people that we got data from within the survey. So kind of potentially reliable. But I totally get your point. And also, fortunately, we'll also add that question in a follow-up survey, so we'll see how people respond. And I love these scope conditions. So maybe this is one of the questions I wanted to borrow your or seek for advice. Like, what are how much? So kind of twofold question. What's the scope condition? Also, more importantly, how far do you think our theory of finding can travel? I think that will help us a lot because like we know Taiwan a lot, and Juan he also know some context in Colombia, but you guys are experts in different countries, especially Iraq and Syria. So maybe you can help us to think about what are places that our theory can travel, so people will not criticize that, oh, it's just another case. And young people, this is also a recurring question that we have. So we will do more analysis in terms of young people because when we presented this last time, everybody was asking, okay, who was clicking the button? So young people is definitely one of the people who just click the button, and there are different reasons. So I, as I'm reflecting on this, I feel like we may not necessarily need to say that, oh, our result kind of eliminate or avoid this cognitive laziness. Because people being lazy and want to seek out a peer review can be a part of our story. We don't necessarily need to eliminate that, right? So, as and our Nami correctly mentioned, the cost is very low. Like just click a button, right? It's not a very costly effort. So I think me and my colleague will think about this and how do we like frame this later on. And also because we're debating on this. And so because we're fortunately to have another opportunity to do the survey, so we also asked in the second survey that, okay, why would people, especially younger people, would want to seek out for peer review? And then we ask them open-ended questions so we can do that.
Howard,
Yes.
I'm gonna jump in really quick, just because I want you to get maximum questions or maximum feedback. So I know Ryan had some questions for you, and so I'm gonna try. Sometimes we don't have it set up where folks can speak directly, but I think you can, Ryan. So let's go ahead and see if you can talk to Howard.
Check. All right. Hey, Howard. Hey, everyone. I have a couple questions and comments that I think hopefully they don't echo too much what's already been said. I think they will reinforce some of the things that have already been said, but maybe from a different angle. And so maybe I'll help you think through some things. Um, One is about sort of scope condition, but not geographical, but rather theoretical. And so we started to think a little bit about this. Mara mentioned Clevis's work, but I was thinking about conflict situations myself, and I was thinking about Northern Ireland in particular, and Ireland, Northern Ireland. And this seems to have implication. There's a lot of informants there too, and they would call them touts, and touts didn't end up in a good position when they were found out. And so this has implications for finding or for how peer groups think about informants, but in a totally different way. That might shape that person's sort of um, what happens to them past social approbation up to and including death. But also then, if you want to push it further, that might actually have um, implications on the conflict itself. So I just think that there's more here where you could think through this, and then that got me thinking more about like, okay, peers are important as opposed to elites. Fine, I'm with you there, but actually we can break peers into in-group, out-group, which you sort of start to think about doing when you're saying people like you or something like that. But then as I kept thinking through the Northern Ireland example, then it's like, okay, your in group is the one who's going to punish you more for being an informant, not the out group, which is kind of interesting. And I think there might be something there. So that's one thing. And then the second thing was the next two things are kind of like theory concept that I'm not sure how like nitty gritty important they are to this paper, but might be helpful to think through as you're thinking through the larger project. And it might have some clues on scope conditions as well, theoretically at least. So one is about ambiguity as a scope condition. And you said ambiguity is when something is contested. But it might actually be when something is just straight up difficult to know. And those are two different things. So I was thinking about like US public opinion on abortion. So in some ways that's contested, but in some ways it's not. Like the camps are set. but it's a super difficult question to answer. Like the reason that it's like has this like pervasive conflict is because people have a hard time, I think at least one of the reasons have a hard time centering like where life begins and doesn't and all and it depends on how you look at it biologically or socially or religiously and all of these things. And so that's just a hard question to answer, maybe one that you never have an answer to, and then that creates space. And that's a difference about there. That's a difference in this like concept of ambiguity. And then lastly, you said as you're like setting up the sort of theory that it's when there's no social consensus that there's opening for social judgments. That suggests that over time those openings will close. And so I don't know like what that means for your theory, but there's actually like this like time story as well. Um, and also then I don't know how to say this except for like, but the button suggests consensus, doesn't it? Or is it just like because the button's like 80 to 95%? And like to me, that sounds like a consensus, but you're saying that this is happening in a place with no consensus. So maybe it's consensus within your peer group. I'm not sure, but I think there's a little bit going on there too that I think is probably worth considering. That's what I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So in the interest of time, I'll just sort of open it up if anyone has other further questions or if our discussants have thought of something else they'd like to add in. Again, this is just to maximize your feedback, Howard. Okay, seeing nothing so far. So in that case, Howard, if there is anything you'd like to sort of close us off with, or respond to Ryan's questions or respond to anything that you haven't had a chance to yet.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. This is a brilliant question. I especially like the no social consensus part. I will need to think more about that and also theorize what's a button. So that's fantastic. But I was speaking too much. So can I ask like in that round, like do you have any other suggestions for us in terms of things to analyze, framing, and others? Or if I may email you guys later on.
I mean, I'll try for the sake of hopefully it'll be helpful. Although this is going to be sort of like shooting from the hip here. But you're saying that, in the next round you have the ability to mess with that button, the numbers in the button. You keep getting questions. No, you don't.
It's a totally different survey, and
Ah,
because people know that we're doing this, they give us money to do another set, just only surveying, no experiments allowed. So basically, we have like 5 to 6 question asking the kind of question people has been asking us, like who are the peers, what are the channels people will refer to, how do young people think, sorts of things like that.
I'm sorry, can I just jump in and comment? I think you have a great opportunity with the next survey, but what would really help with a paper like this, especially work that's usually done on collaborators, and with some of my experience with some of my recent work that's been going through the review process, constantly had reviewers push me to include qualitative evidence. It would be really nice if you're able to interview some of the respondents and actually ask them why is it they clicked the button? Do they think 80, what does 80 to 95% really symbolize? So some of the things that Ryan was getting at, does that actually mean overall consensus? That would really, yeah, that would help narrow and really refine your argument. Because in terms of, I do have a list that I will send you of some of the robustness checks and then just some other tests that I think you should conduct based on what I was able to get from how the data looks like. But I think the step with covering a lot of some of the concerns regarding demand effects, regarding whether some things are plausible, whether it's who are the peers, who are they even thinking about, whose judgments would they consider, because it is a matter who's in your network. A lot of these concerns can just be covered if you did a qualitative component of it. And I think a lot of the top journals do really like mixed method work. And it would help you a lot, but I just don't know if I don't know if that's feasible if you are able to do qualitative.
It's feasible because we asked them to write up a text box saying that could you please um, tell us why did you make the choice? So they have messages written out. So we can do some text analysis to investigate. Yeah. So brilliant suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would also just second the suggestion. That sounds like very rich data that you can, and it's a request that I also commonly get from reviewers to really sort of validate and think through how we sort of qualitatively what do these judgments look like and what are respondents actually thinking about. So it's great that you did that, and definitely would be interested to see that incorporated into the paper.
Go ahead, Ryan. Sorry, that was my thumbs up to you.
Yeah, that's okay. And just as we're like throwing things out there to end, um, I also was just like curious the extent to which politics matter, given that we're political scientists. And so, you said the government wasn't taking a stance, but I wonder, I just do not know this. I'm ignorant. Like, are certain political parties taking a stance? And then we know some recent work where like partisanship basically trumps everything on some of these questions. And so what, or ideology or how, depending on the party structure there. So like, I just wonder, maybe it's not elites from the government, but elites from somewhere else. And so I know you have a bottom up story, but it might be something that people ask.
Yeah, great question. So bizarrely, the politicians right now are kind of muted because this is like the typical illustration theory, right? Skeleton classes, right? You do you want to really blame those people who used to be your friends and allies? Like, so some people say we should do that because some people are enraged because they saw the surveillance and the informants who were their friends and allies. But other people say, oh, for the sake of the winning election, we should not say anything. So people are like, they are muted. That's why there's an empty space for opinion. But I think we probably should mention that in our context page where we actually substantiate that our experiments actually reflecting the fact on the ground in Taiwan, with just no one actually providing like concrete suggestion on what we want to do. Yeah.
So
I'm just sorry.
it's
Just
okay. I mean, if you can make it quick, we'll let you go. Unfortunately, I got to wrap us up.
I think that's a really important point Ryan brings up, and I think you should look into it because that can actually further help you develop the scope conditions. There are vacuums where elites are not giving any cues. Libya is one of them. So your work does generalize to other regions. I think you just need to let us know what exact, and you've done this a bit already, what are the environments where peer cues from peers would actually, or your network would matter more or less than peers from the elites. And then just developing this a bit more can help us know exactly where the theory can generalize to. Thank you so much.
Awesome, everyone. Well, I feel like we could consider or continue this discussion for quite some time because it is such a great paper. Howard and co-authors, thank you for bringing it to us. Huge thank you to Mara and Narmin for taking the time to go through this. Ryan, thanks for your additional questions. Audience members, thanks for participating here. I should have thanked Mason earlier, who is the person who makes all of this happen, the one who sends you all the emails and everything. So thank you, Mason.
Thank
Um,
you.
Yeah. So we will wrap up here. I see that Howard has requested some written comments. Just a reminder to folks that you can find this on, we have a YouTube page where it will be uploaded. So Howard, if you do want to go back and just rewatch everything, you're welcome to do that, or if anyone else does. And we'll be back soon with another session. So again, huge thanks to each of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Fridays.